Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news.
This is the Bloomberg Daybreak Europe podcast, available every morning on Apple, Spotify or wherever you listen. It's Wednesday, the 10th of July in London. I'm Caroline Hepker.
And I'm Stephen Carroll. Coming up today, Keir Starmer says Ukraine can use UK missiles to strike inside Russia as he arrives in Washington for his first NATO summit.
Democrats come out in support of Joe Biden as questions over his candidacy persist.
Plus, circumventing the NIMBYs for a price. Our exclusive reporting finds that UK home builders are splashing cash in a bid to bypass the UK's planning system.
Let's start with a roundup of our top stories.
The UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer says it's up to Ukraine how it uses Britain's Storm Shadow missiles in the Russia-Ukraine war, including whether the long-range weapons are used to strike military targets inside Russia, quote, for defensive purposes. It confirms the Labour government will continue the previous UK government's policy on the Russia-Ukraine war. Starmer was speaking to a Bloomberg reporter and other journalists on the plane on his way to the NATO summit in Washington. There is a debate among NATO allies about whether Ukraine can strike military targets inside Russia, something the Kremlin has previously called a very dangerous statement. It's expected to be a central issue discussed at the NATO summit.
Well, during the summit, Keir Starmer is expected to say that a step up in defence spending can safeguard the future of the alliance. He says the UK is committed to reassessing its current defence budget.
We will carry out our strategic review to look at the challenges, the capabilities, and on the back of that make further plans. I am committed to that 2.5% within our fiscal rules, but that strategic review needs to come first.
Starmer also promised to publish a roadmap showing how the UK would get to that 2.5% target on defence spending after facing calls for further clarity from British military and foreign allies. The Prime Minister went on to tell reporters that the country will, quote, stand against Russian aggression. The UK is one of NATO's biggest spenders and has been a key supplier of arms to Ukraine since Russia's invasion.
NATO allies are offering Ukraine more defence systems in a fresh pledge of support. The US, Germany and Romania will each send Ukraine a Patriot missile system, while a fourth will be assembled using parts from the Netherlands and others. Italy will send a ground-based air defence system. Speaking during the NATO summit in Washington, President Joe Biden promised to prioritise Ukrainian aid.
The United States will make sure that when we export critical air defence interceptors, Ukraine goes to the front of the line. They will get this assistance before anyone else gets it. All told, Ukraine will receive hundreds of additional interceptors over the next year, helping protect Ukrainian cities against Russian missiles.
President Biden speaking there at a NATO 75th anniversary celebratory event. Despite the commitment, the group's leaders resisted offering the country a path to membership despite growing concerns over the prospect of peace with Russia. Some pledges to send defence systems, including those from the US, Italy and Romania, had already been announced prior to the NATO summit.
As Biden made that NATO announcement, congressional Democrats argued over whether to stand behind his re-election bid. More House Democrats and a senator have now publicly called on the president to step aside. Pete Aquila chairs the Democrat caucus and spoke after a closed-door meeting.
Every single member of the House Democratic caucus is clear-eyed about what the stakes of this election are. Donald Trump cannot be allowed near the Oval Office.
Pete Aquila said they are focused now on beating Donald Trump. The White House are trying to change the subject from the president's mental sharpness to Donald Trump's policy goals. Many Democrats pointed to the Heritage Foundation's Project 2025 as proposals Trump would pursue if elected in November. Trump has tried to distance himself from the controversial set of policies.
Former French Prime Minister Edouard Philippe is calling for centre and centre-right parties to form a coalition government. It comes as political negotiations take place following a snap election in which no political grouping achieved an outright majority. The left-wing alliance New Popular Front now has the most lawmakers in the National Assembly, followed by President Macron's centrist alliance and the far-right National Rally. It's now up to Macron to choose a Prime Minister with no defined deadline in place.
Now, Jerome Powell says that the US labour market has cooled considerably and the Fed needs more data to assess whether inflation is slowing. The Fed chair was careful not to give Congress a timeline for interest rate cuts in his semi-annual testimony. He warned that inflation is not the only risk facing the US.
This is no longer an overheated economy. This is an economy, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, that is more or less back by most measures to where it was before the pandemic. And that was a strong labor market, but it was not an overheated labor market.
Powell will speak again to the House Financial Services Committee later today. Democrats warned Powell of the potential risks to the economy from delaying interest rate cuts, pointing to rising unemployment, elevated housing costs and a slowdown in the manufacturing sector.
China's consumer prices hovered near zero for a fifth month in June as deflation stalks the Chinese economy. The data comes ahead of a key policy meeting of the ruling Communist Party next week. Bloomberg's Brian Curtis has more from Hong Kong.
Yet another sign that deflation is stalking the Chinese economy. The CPI rose 0.2% from a year earlier, weaker than the estimate of 0.4%. In the meantime, factory gate prices declined 0.8%, in line with estimates. The PPI has been in deflation since late 2022. China's economy is uneven. Some strength in manufacturing, some weakness in consumption. Investors are hoping for a fix from the third plenum next week. In Hong Kong, Brian Curtis, Bloomberg Radio.
In a moment, we'll have more on that NATO summit and Ukraine, as well as Bloomberg's special report on the UK's dysfunctional planning system. But first, another story that caught our eye this morning. Do you think that in hundreds of years people might be able to come back from the dead? Cryogenic freezing, once considered a madcap idea, is now just considered slightly eccentric, according to one of the people who spoke to our colleagues for this Bloomberg reporting about how people are not only preparing to freeze themselves, but also preparing to freeze their assets, so they've got some cash when they come back.
Absolutely. This is perhaps the most important question. I think this is a really nice piece because people are actually trying to do this, trying to adapt the rules around trusts and inheritance, usually for wealthy, multi-generational dynasties, and try to convert that to something that you could use if you manage to come back to life in 200 or 300 years' time. I mean, one of the fundamental issues is, are you actually dead if you are preserved, and are you actually you if you then come back again? If you're revived, let's say, are you the same person? It's actually quite tricky, and the piece goes into all the detail with a few lawyers who've been looking into it. Yeah,
it's an emerging area of law. Revival trusts that tend to get around the usual lifespan on trusts that tend to be about 90 to 100 years. Apparently in Florida you can have a 1,000-year trust. So that's something that lawyers have been looking at very keenly.
Now, NATO allies have promised 5 long-range air defence systems for Ukraine, but have resisted offering the country a path to membership. This at the start of the meeting in Washington. And Prime Minister Keir Starmer says that it's up to Ukraine how it uses Britain's donated Storm Shadow missiles. The first time the new Prime Minister has clearly articulated his stance. Joining us now is Bloomberg's UK politics reporter James Walcock. This is some of our own reporting here, speaking to Keir Starmer. We've been really wondering what might change about UK foreign policy under the new Labour Prime Minister. This is confirmation there doesn't seem to be any change on the Ukraine war.
If anything, as well as noted, it's a commitment to continuing the UK government's previous stance of being one of the staunchest hawks in Europe when it comes to supporting Ukraine. You'll know, Caroline, because we covered it recently, that the Defence Secretary John Healey made his trip on his second day in the job to Ukraine over the weekend and promised additional munitions, boats, artillery, and some of these Storm Shadow missiles are effectively cruise missiles which have a range of 155 miles. So from Kyiv, you could just about get over the Russian border. Obviously, if you went further east, you could also reach further into Russia. Like you say, this has been a very tense international issue because for Ukraine, who, just as soon as this past week have been hit by cruise missiles in their capital, killing 41 civilians and also hitting a children's hospital, they see hitting Russia as a key part of defending themselves. For the US, they see escalating tensions with Russia, especially with Western-made weaponry, as a key red line. Now, like you say, Sunak's stance for a very long time when he was Prime Minister was, if Ukraine use the missiles to their own ends and they've been donated to end use of their defence, that is not business of the British state. Now, that is a very kind of opaque stance that sort of says, if it ends up in Russia, we'd rather it didn't, but it's not our issue. Now, crucially, Emmanuel Macron in May of this year said he would actively be okay with French missiles because the cruise Storm Shadows are a Franco-British project ending up in Russia. So it is no change, but no change in some ways is a stronger commitment as we end up in sort of heading into the second year of this war.
And this, of course, one of the things how NATO allies in particular can support Ukraine, one of the issues up for discussion at the summit taking place in Washington. Keir Starmer was speaking on the way to that summit. NATO has agreed to more donations of weapons to Ukraine. What do we know about that?
Well, it all comes back to this issue of the air war where we started, Stephen, in that Ukraine sees air defence as a massive priority for itself as it continues to get bombarded from Russia. And so these Patriot systems, which are these very high-tech ways of policing the air, are all important, and the US has promised to donate 4 in context with Poland, Germany and Italy and the Netherlands. Now, Poland's ones were actually part of a arms deal to supply Poland. They're going, rather than going to Poland, they're going straight to Ukraine. Now, the Ukraine wanted 7, it's only getting 5, and one of them isn't even a Patriot system, it's Italy's ground-based system. And so how far this support can be guaranteed, how quickly it will get there after we've covered, the US Congress months of delay over sort of spending on aid is going to be key questions. But the other key question, Stephen, is what is the long-term view here, especially looking ahead to the US election? Donald Trump has said that the US is committing too much aid in the sort of wake ahead of this NATO summit and has said that Europe needs to match US spending on this. So what is going to be the future over 4 months of these sort of donations, as well as what is happening right now?
Yeah, absolutely. 3-day summit, of course, taking place in Washington with the 32 NATO countries. So one story that we will continue to follow for you. James Alcock, our UK politics reporter, thank you so much for that.
Now, a Bloomberg News investigation derived from roughly 150 freedom of information requests has revealed even more dysfunction in Britain's planning system. In a week where Labour has announced plans to reform the system, Bloomberg's investigation reveals home builders are resorting to paying thousands of pounds for more attention from underfunded local authorities with no guarantee that it will actually improve the process. Our residential real estate reporter Damien Shepherd joins us now with more on this story. Damien, good morning. What is this tool that home builders are using?
Yeah, so we're venturing into a niche area of the planning system here known as planning performance agreements, or PPAs. Now, these agreements hold planning teams to stricter deadlines and more frequent communication with home builder applicants. It essentially leapfrogs the wealthiest builders who can afford them over other applicants and puts them at the front of the local authority's desk when it comes to their development ideas. But as we know with the planning system, it doesn't always go as smoothly as that.
So is it working then?
Not really. Most builders see this purely as a tax that's essential in the process to get their house building applications looked at. Lots of builders I've spoken to have reported equally as slow decision making. These aren't legally binding contracts, so there's no penalty for the councils in missing the deadlines, even when the builders pay more to get those stricter deadlines agreed to. This is a desperate measure that we've uncovered here that the builders who can afford to are using just to sort of slightly boost their chances of getting planning permission through faster.
Why have they had to resort to this, Damien?
So it all comes back to one thing, a lack of resource in local authority planning departments. This is from years of underfunding and a severe lack of staff in local authorities. Delays have become an absolute given in planning. And as I say, this is a desperate measure to try and just lower those delays slightly and get more housing units out there that the UK desperately needs and these home builders desperately need to boost their numbers. Now, the richest builders would pay even more to improve this punctuality. So this is a desperate measure that isn't even quite working and really shows the dysfunction that's happening in this planning system.
So I suppose one could wonder whether there's going to be more use of these PPAs and also whether there's a knock-on effect to the smaller builders. Maybe, you keep talking about the richest builders. What about the ones that might not have the cash to pay this, as you call it, additional little tax?
Exactly. Well, their use is rising every year. It's risen every year for almost a decade now, the use of PPAs. And it's accelerated even more in recent years, which is very interesting because we've had a slump in development, but the use of PPAs is increasing, which sort of indicates that a bigger share of builders are using them. Now, it's a really good point you make on SMEs because they can't afford to use these. And as I said earlier, it leapfrogs you over other applicants to the front of the local authority's desk. And I've spoken to SME builders, one that was trying to build 12 units in London and can't get any attention from the local authority because it can't afford this PPA tax, as it's known, that other builders can. So it's pushing SMEs further down the pile, putting large builders' applications to the front of the local authority's desk, and still to no avail.
Will Labour's pledges to improve the planning system actually reduce the use of these PPAs?
I'd say probably the most important pledge that relates to this is Labour's promise to hire 300 planners in the next Parliament, but that would only cover less than 10% of the planners who left during the first 10 years of the Tory rule. There's a massive deficit here of funding and staff in local authority planning departments, and the pledge doesn't seem to scratch the surface when you look back at the numbers, but only time will tell if the pledges will translate into action.
This is Bloomberg Daybreak Europe, your morning brief on the stories making news from London to Wall Street and beyond.
Look for us on your podcast feed every morning on Apple, Spotify and anywhere else you get your podcasts.
You can also listen live each morning on London DAB Radio, the Bloomberg Business app and Bloomberg.com.
Our flagship New York station is also available on your Amazon Alexa devices. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130. I'm Caroline Hepker.
And I'm Stephen Carroll. Join us again tomorrow morning for all the news you need to start your day, right here on Bloomberg Daybreak Europe.